A big part of my career has been looking at the therapeutic value of the 12 steps because the 12 steps really have harnessed some powerful psychological forces that creates an amazing change in our life. What is that change? Well, the truth is that the 12 steps are engineered to help us achieve emotional sobriety, to achieve true independence of spirit, to achieve autonomy, to learn how to take care of ourselves. These are things that we don't know. Emotional sobriety really helps us learn how to have a healthy relationship, how to have union with the preservation of our integrity, how to cooperate with integrity. Most of us get lost in our relationships. Most of us do a lot of things we don't want to do. We don't really know how to show up in a good way. Emotional sobriety is about learning to have healthy relationships. Well, tonight we are continuing our discussion of my latest book, 12 Essential Insights for Emotional Sobriety. We just finished up going through the 12 steps and looking at how they really help us develop what we called an authentic self-esteem, and how that self-esteem then is related to emotional sobriety. And I think that there was no question that the conclusion we came to at the end of those, almost a year, Roger, I think, and Herb, that we went through the steps in emotional sobriety, that emotional sobriety is dependent on self-esteem. You cannot have emotional sobriety without raising your self-esteem. And if you think of self-esteem just as the reputation you have with yourself, or what we'll talk about tonight is the relationship you have with reality and with yourself and with others. That's a big part of what self-esteem is, and it's very much related to what we're going to be talking about tonight, which is the second essential insight, which is living consciously. So I want you to think of consciousness on a continuum. We can have less consciousness, or what I would call a dull consciousness in our life, or we can have more consciousness, or what I would like to think of as an acute consciousness. Now, we're also going to be using the term awareness synonymously with consciousness. Awareness is consciousness. Consciousness is awareness. So we can be unaware, or we can be aware. Our awareness can be dull, or it can be crisp and sharp and acute. Now, the choice in our life, and I think that it doesn't become a choice until we really start to look at this issue, because most of us live our lives very mechanically. The first insight we talked about is that we are asleep, dreaming, we're awake, and that we have to wake up from our sleepwalking. And as we start to wake up from our sleepwalking, we realize that our lives have been very mechanical. We've been like an automaton. Our behavior is so fixed, so stereotyped, to the point where most of us have lost interest in ourselves, which sounds like a weird thing to say. But the truth is that when you're just going through life and going through the motions, it's very easy to become bored with yourself and to lose interest in yourself. So when we start to look at these possibilities, we realize we have a choice a choice about how much consciousness we can bring to our lives. Now, there's a price you're going to pay, because when you bring more consciousness to your life, that doesn't mean that you're going to be happy, joyous, and free all the time. Because a lot of the time, you're going to realize how you're sabotaging yourself. You're going to realize how low your self-esteem is. You're going to realize about your emotional dependence, and how you don't even know how to be very sincere with yourself in your life. But you're also going to see new possibilities, and you're going to get excited, because with consciousness comes a fresh look at our lives. And I'll say that again, with living a conscious life comes taking a fresh look at our lives. Now, to live consciously means to be committed to an awareness as a way of being in the world, and to bring such activity, or to each activity, a level of awareness appropriate to that activity. So let me say what I mean by that. So living consciously means being committed to an awareness as a way of being in the world, and to bring to each activity a level of consciousness appropriate to that activity. Fritz Perls, which was the co-founder, and some people think of him as the founder of Gestalt therapy, said a very interesting thing at one point. I thought it was a baffling statement to me until I really started to understand it in this context. He says, if you let the situation you're in control you, then you learn how to cope, then you learn how to grow up, and you learn how to mature. So what he means in that each situation defines certain possibilities for us. And if we're in relationship, or in a conscious relationship, or in an aware relationship to that circumstance we're in, then we will have the best possible response in that situation to take care of ourselves or to get our needs met. If I'm in a situation where somebody's angry and I'm trying to get them to understand my point, it may not be a good time for me to talk about that, because they're too wrapped up in what they're upset about. That it may be better for me to wait and give them a chance to calm themselves down, and then talk to them about what's important to me. A lot of us do not want to yield to the situation because we feel like we're being controlled by it. But you see, this is the difference. When you bring a consciousness to your life, you are making a choice to respond to that situation that way. You're not letting the situation decide it. You're making a decision based on what's appropriate and what's available in that particular situation you're in. Now, to do that, to have that degree of flexibility, you have to let go of a lot of your expectations about how things have to be, and begin to have a relationship to reality as it is, an honest relationship to reality. And that's one of the things that happens as we live consciously. Our relationship to reality becomes much more honest. So living consciously involves having a respect for reality, a respect for the facts and truth that are in front of us. So to live effectively, we must bring our consciousness and awareness to ourself, to others, or whoever else is participating in the situation we're in, and also to the context of that situation, or the environment or reality of that situation that we find ourselves in. Now, what are what we call the contact functions that we use in our consciousness, and to be able to have the relationship, this honest relationship to reality? So let me go through our contact functions. A contact function is how I make contact with myself, how I make contact with you, and how I make contact with reality. So the first mechanism we have is looking and seeing. It's amazing how much of the time we look at a situation and we really don't see what's going on. I had a client say to me one time, he says, I don't see what I look at. Isn't that an interesting statement he made? I don't see what I look at. Because what he was saying is that if something isn't the way that he wanted it to be, he wouldn't look at it. He wouldn't deal with it. He wouldn't cope with it. He avoided it. He'd run away from it. The next contact function we have is listening. So the first one is with our eyes. The second one is with our ears. It's how we listen to the situation. Do you want to hear someone's truth? Can you hear someone's truth? Can you hear somebody's feedback about who you are or who you aren't, especially if what they're telling you is something you don't want to hear? Do you listen to yourself? Do you make contact with yourself and try to pay attention to what's important to you? I had a somatic therapy session today, or bodywork session today, and a lot of the session was focused on me paying attention to how I was reacting to something that this other person was offering me. Did I like it or did I not? And not from a cognitive or cerebral place, intellectual place, but to pay attention to what my body was telling me. Something I don't do much in my life. It was unbelievable in terms of the ahas I had in that session today. Touching is another way we make contact. How we touch another person, how we touch our environment, how we touch ourselves. Talking, it's a major contact function because as we become adults, we mostly make contact with our environment through our speech, through our language. Dr. Kempler, my mentor, said that the challenge for each of us is to find the words which most accurately reflect and reveal who we are at any particular moment in our life, and to find the courage to say them, which means to find the courage to be vulnerable. Moving is another way we make contact. Moving through our space, how we move through our space. Smelling and tasting. These are all contact functions. And we can bring our awareness to any one of these particular areas that we make contact with. And what I'm hoping we are able to do as we continue to grow is we're able to pay attention to all of these different dimensions. Now, remember, integrity means wholeness. It means that I am operating from all of me, not just parts of me. Well, I want to end this by just reading a description of consciousness or living consciously that Dr. Nathaniel Branden has in his book, The Art of Living Consciously. He says, living consciously is a state of being mentally and emotionally active rather than passive. It is the ability to look at the world through fresh eyes. It is intelligence taking joy in its own function. Living consciously is seeking to be aware of everything that bears on our interests, on our actions, values, purposes, and goals. It is the willingness to confront facts, pleasant or unpleasant. It is the desire to discover our mistakes and correct them. Within the range of our interest and concerns, it is the quest to keep expanding our awareness and understanding, both of the world external to us and of the world within us. It is respect for reality and respect for the distinction between the real and the unreal. It is understanding that our feelings are not an infallible guide to the truth, and they can be distorted from previous experiences, especially ones that are traumatic. It is a recognition, no, it is the commitment to see what we see and know what we want. It is the recognition that the act of dismissing reality is at the root of all of our troubles. So with that being said, I will invite Roger and Herb into this space and let's hear what their comments are and then invite you to share. And then next week, Roger, if you would take on living consciously, and then Herb will follow that, and then I'll follow that up with another week of discussing living consciously.
Okay. Hello, Herb. Um, I'll go ahead and start, Herb, if that's all right.
Oh, yes, that's fine. Thank you.
Sure. Well, I really liked your description of those contact functions, what I think of as contact modalities, right? And as you pointed out, Alan, most of those, all of them, really involve sensory function. One of them, talking, involves and moving as well, involve motor functions, behavior, action. But it's the combination of the two that allow us to either make or avoid contact. So a couple of things came up, Al. I would add one more that's implicit as far as contact function. Because when we are seeing, when we are listening and hearing, when we are touching, when we are tasting or smelling, a kind of larger category to think about those modalities in is we are doing what? We are receiving, right? We are receiving input. And we don't just receive input at a sensory level, but it also very much applies, as you were talking about from your experience today, Alan, with the somatic therapy. That issue is very important at an emotional level. Most of us have developed in our efforts to become our idealized self and our efforts to protect ourselves emotionally, a lot of ways of defending ourselves emotionally, of not letting ourselves be conscious of feelings that we learn to devalue, to judge, that we feel ashamed of or embarrassed by or humiliated by. So we close off vast levels of awareness or consciousness regarding our emotions. The development of receptivity at an emotional level, you used the word a minute ago, means developing enough ability and courage to be vulnerable, to be receptive, to actually allow others to impact us. And I like to emphasize that because we can get the mistaken notion, since excessive emotional dependency is emphasized so much, in obstacles to emotional sobriety. But don't mistake that for being an island unto ourselves. Don't mistake that for meaning we are supposed to be self-sufficient and totally self-reliant. It's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about, again, as you referenced, Alan, is using all of who we are, our receptivity and our ability to assert ourselves, both, depending on what? Depending on the situation that we are in and the responses that we feel like are going to be most effective, not just for us, but also for other people or the situation that we're in. The last thing I wanted to mention is an idea that helps me a lot with regard to consciousness, and it's rooted in self-acceptance. There is a flow to our energy, to our life, to each moment of our awareness. There is a flow of attention, a flow of energy. That flow is always going on. Now, I might be obstructing it. I might be rolling with it. I might be oblivious to it. But the perspective that's helped me so much is all of those processes are part of the flow of experience. If I'm allowing my feelings to be present for me and aware of them, that's part of my flow. If I'm blocking those feelings like crazy, or judging them like crazy, or totally pretending to be someone or something that I'm not at a given moment, that can also be viewed as part of my flow. So, because it's just another element of my experience, right? So if I can have that attitude, then I can start to become open rather than judgmental toward any aspect of my experience. Remember those words we cited from Nathaniel Brandon earlier? do not be in an adversarial relationship to our own experience. Doesn't mean we give our feelings privilege all the time. We don't think what our feelings want us to do is the best thing for us to do necessarily at all. But the awareness is the key piece, the consciousness. So a great way to begin to expand our consciousness is to notice where we are restricting it. And it's hard to do. They're called blind spots for a reason. Okay. It's hard to see them, as Herb, you've commented about many times. But if I can start to notice in my body when I'm tensing up, when I'm being avoidant with my eye contact or my orientation toward another person, if I can notice thoughts that come into my mind that I distract myself from immediately, those are the kinds of clues that parts of us are giving us about where we are diminishing our consciousness. You gave some sentences at the end of this chapter, Al. You do all of them. And some of the sentences I like to use that help me with this are things like, I prevent myself from seeing and knowing when I prevent myself from feeling when something I'd rather not know about myself is, something I don't like to see about myself is. I'm afraid if I let myself know this, I might. It's very helpful because all these areas where we've diminished our consciousness, yes, they're part of our effort to become our idealized self, but they're also expressions of fear of some form of pain, including abandonment and so on. So just paying attention to how we are turning our attention away from certain situations or people or aspects of ourselves, for most of us, is a very valuable starting point. And it's just part of the flow of our process, part of our coping mechanism, part of what we learned, usually in our development, not always, sometimes later in life, especially if we went through very traumatic experiences later in life. So I want us to get away from shoulds with this. I shouldn't be avoidant. I shouldn't be this. I shouldn't be that. That's not the point to me. The point is learn to pay attention when I notice I'm being avoidant. Learn to pay attention to my anxiety when it wants me to stay away from certain situations or people that part of me wants to approach that I think would be good for me. Learn to pay attention to the whole spectrum of our experience, not just the ideas we have in our head about who we should be, even who we want to be, or what we should be experiencing. That's what I've got. Thank you.
Thanks, Roger. Thanks, Alan. Once again, lots of notes, reactions, connections, puzzle pieces becoming clearer and fitting, but I'm not sure how it all works out. So I'm just going to start looking at the notes that I made. You gave several synonyms, Alan, for consciousness. One was awareness, and Roger just gave one that's one of my favorite, which is attention. One of my friends has a mantra. He said, just pay attention. Just pay attention. I see this consciousness, well, it's my own experience, as the dimmer switch I've talked about, that it goes on at a point in a mysterious way sometimes, or maybe it's as the result of some effort on our part, but it goes on enough to be able to be aware of the implications of what you both said. Because I attended school, I went to graduate school. I was a meditating monk for 7 years, but I had no consciousness of my consciousness. I had lots of information and I could have lots of debate and discussion and intelligent stuff. I'm not talking about nasty, but I wasn't living in any integrity, not knowing that I wasn't in integrity. And so addiction, that's the point here that came to me as Alan was talking. Addiction really distorts this. You talked about the Fritz Perls and the normal early development of coping and growing up and mature. You know, most of the addiction gets hold of us in the teens, young, and really catches hold in college, where or when we've left the home and we have no supervision. And I know, and I don't know the implications of it, that the brain actually doesn't develop in adults until you're 25 or 26 years old. And so from 15 to 25, so many people have been soaking their brains in some form of drug or alcohol, which has got to really distort perceptions. I don't know actually the implication of that. I think it's almost obvious. One of the things that you said, the level, I wrote it, I'm not sure you said it, but something stimulated me to write this. The level of our consciousness determines how free we really are. I've studied, I'm a dilettante in terms of studying the Buddhist kind of way of life, and their whole point, their whole way of life is one of consciousness. My sense is it's misinterpreted to be somewhat passive, and that's one of the things that you said. This is an active thing. This isn't passive. Consciousness is active, but it also translates into action, or at least that's my Western culture mentality of it. But I also was impressed, Alan, and you and I have talked about this in terms of our emotional sobriety stuff. The lenses through which we look depends on what we, determines what we see. And if we don't know our lens are distorted, then we don't know that what we're processing is distorted. That is certainly was sort of my hallmark. You quoted somebody saying, dismissing reality, excuse me. Oh yeah, dismissing reality is the root of our trouble. Actually, not seeing reality. I never dismissed reality in any conscious way. I just didn't see it. I didn't process it, and I was not aware that I lived in a mythical world. So I'm gonna, the synonym for spirituality. You were talking about spiritual awakening. My term, and Alan, you've heard me say this, is relationship, just like you described it. Spirituality, aka relationship with life, relationship with myself, and relationship with others. It's immaterial. Like my thought, my thinking process is immaterial. My decision process is immaterial. You can't really, I mean, you kind of process it and you kind of see the results of it. And that's how then I change my thinking and I change my decisions if I'm not getting the results that I wanted. And normally I was in the mode of self-development and self-help when I was doing all of that. And now spirituality has another dimension to me, that fourth dimension that's talked about in the book. Bill actually says, and when you started, Alan, I was reminded of that phrase. He said, we're reborn. We're reborn when we get this consciousness. We're given a whole brand new life. I wrote down three practical things, because it's my experience too. Willingness. I don't know how you get people to be willing. Number one. And the set aside attitude, that open mind, open heart. I mean, truly, not just mouthing, oh yeah, I have no, I mean, truly listening and processing, accepting as potentially credible, and taking some action on it. The single most important piece in all of this, as I've come to now see, at least currently, is a teacher, an accountability partner, a coach that has some knowledge and some experience, some credibility, and can be the sounding board that I trust, so that I can fine tune my navigation of reality, just bouncing it off in the mirror. Not a parent, not a a control person, no, just somebody who holds a mirror up so that they're reflecting back to me objectively, to the best of their ability, what they're seeing and what their experience tells me. So those are some of the thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you. Raj, what I'd like to do, Raj, take two of those sentence stems and let's read those two things and ask. What I'd like everybody to do is pull out a pen and paper and write down a few endings to those. And then when you raise your hand to come in and participate, share two of the endings or one ending to each of the two sentence stems that stand out to you. So pick two, Raj, that you think are going to be pretty powerful.
Okay. I prevent myself from knowing what I know when I. So this is a how question, right? I prevent myself from knowing what I know when I blank. And again,
so write down three endings to that.
Yeah.
I present myself from knowing what I know when
I'm afraid if I become more conscious or more aware, either word, I might. I'm afraid if I become more aware, I might.
Okay, three endings to that. And then if you want to, share one response of each of those two endings with the group so we can hear what everybody is experiencing or how they are reacting to those two prompts.
If we want to put one that's more positive and focused, it would be if I took ownership of what I really know, I would. If I took ownership of what I really know, I would.
Okay. Yeah. And Tom has put those in the chat if you need some help in remembering them. And when you come on to share, read the sentence stem and then give us your ending.
Does someone need to believe in God to successfully overcome addiction? Well, the way I like to think about what the program does, it connects us to who we really are. And what does that mean? Well, there's this incredible force in you and I, this growth force. It's the force that moved us from crawling to walking. You wanted to take those first steps. And when you fell, and you fell a lot of times, you didn't let your failures stop you. You picked yourself up, you learned from it. And how many times did you fail before you walked? You failed as many times as you needed to. You see that force, I call it a biological imperative, a psychological imperative, a spiritual imperative. It's moving you towards wholeness. It's moving you to be what you can be. Just like in the acorn is all the information it needs to become an oak tree. In you is all the information you need to become you. Become a you that can cope with life and to deal with whatever you need to deal with to be okay. And that's what I'll talk about in my new book, The 12 Essential Insights for Emotional Sobriety.